Part of your proxy statement filed with the SEC, you will include certain biographical information about your directors, your director nominees, and executive officers. Today on Zippy Point. I'm Brown-Forman. I'm a big fan of use. So before I bring on Leah and Candace to explain how to provide this disclosure in more detail, let's run down some of the basics. Some companies have been very creative in their proxies when it comes to this section in recent years. In fact, the trend of hiring proxy designers to help make a proxy more inviting, more readable, stems from having a director or officer becoming a champion to convert the proxy from a staid, boring document, to something that becomes much more alive because they sit on another board where the proxy has been enhanced, and they like that, and they want that same treatment at this company too, so that they can literally look better in the document, in your proxy. Many companies now place headshots of the directors adjacent to their bios. That's not required, as well as use other formatting methods, other techniques to make the disclosures easier to read, easier to understand at a glance, like background shading or different color coding for every other director. The possibilities are endless. And I have a separate Vid-Guide about proxy design in this area, a link to which is beneath this video. So we're going to look at a bunch of nifty examples after we run through the other legal requirements here. The legal requirements. Item 7B of Schedule 14A refers to Item 401 of Regulation SK, and then Part 3, Item 10 of Form 10K does so as well, which typically incorporates the disclosure by reference from the proxy into the 10K. This information is elicited by items 101A through E specifically of Regulation SK. Note that item 407C of SK requires disclosure about the nominating committee process, and item 401F requires disclosure about director qualifications and skills, which are the subject of two separate Vid-Guides. Links to those videos are beneath this one. So which officers are covered? Item 401B requires disclosure of all the company's executive officers, and your officer list should be comprised of the current executive officers as of the Form 10K proxy statement filing date. So it doesn't include any directors or officers who have left the company. So your list is not necessarily who served in those roles during or as of the last day of your last fiscal year, as clarified by this CorpFin staff interpretation. Exchange Act Rule 3B7 defines executive officer. Here's the definition from that rule. A company's president, any vice president in charge of a principal business unit, division, or function, and any other officer who performs a policy-making function. Policy-making function, that's an important term. The note to Rule 16A1F provides that policy-making function isn't intended to include policy-making functions that are not significant. Officer duties rather than titles guide this determination. The good old facts and circumstances determination, facts and circumstances. Judgment calls might need to be made, they often are, in particular determining whether a business unit, division, or function is a principal one, or whether a person's realm of responsibility involves a significant policy-making function. This can be challenging. In considering what is a policy-making function, you might give thought as to whether an officer is a direct report to your CEO. While not dispositive, if an officer is 2 or 3 spots down the food chain, she reports to another executive who then reports to someone who then reports to the CEO. That's one factor in determining whether their policy-making authority is up to snuff, perhaps not. The bottom line should be whether the officer actually participates or has the authority to participate in policy-making functions at the company. Another factor is the company's business activities. Is this officer the head of a huge business unit for the company? If so, that's probably enough. Unfortunately, internal corporate politics definitely play a role at many companies when it comes to who is an executive officer. Sometimes officers are deemed to be executive officers to keep the peace, even though they don't really have policy-making functions, policy-making responsibilities that rise to that threshold. The people making the executive officer determination can't bring themselves to tell them that their stature isn't equal to others at the same level on the company's org chart. There's sometimes squabbling. It's often above the head of actually the person drafting the disclosure, people complaining to the CEO, all that kind of stuff. Then there are those people smart enough to not want the parade of regulatory horribles for being tapped an executive officer. They don't want to be deemed an executive officer, even though they do have a significant policymaking function. It's too bad for them. They fall within the rule and they have to be named. They fall within the definition. Look for my separate vid guide that explains the list of these parade of horribles for being named, a link to which is beneath this video. Which directors are covered? Instruction 3 to item 401A states that directors whose terms of office as directors won't continue after the upcoming shareholders meeting should not be included in this disclosure so long as two conditions are met. This CorpFin staff interpretation includes those two conditions. A company can rely on instruction 3 to omit disclosure of a non-continuing director biographical information if 1, the 10K incorporates Part 3 information from the proxy, which happens a lot, and 2, the proxy is filed within 120 days after the end of the company's fiscal year. That's why you typically see annual meetings in April or May. The proxy is filed easily within the 120-day period. And this is for a calendar year, fiscal year-end company. Advisory or honorary directors aren't included. There's not many of those around anymore, but if you do have them, they're not included in this disclosure. They're not real directors in the fiduciary duty sense, nor in this item 401 sense. Officer list is almost always in the 10K, not the proxy. Under instruction 1 to item 401, information about executive officers required by item 401, including their names and ages, positions in offices, terms of office, selection arrangements required by item 101B, isn't required in the proxy if it has already been disclosed in the Form 10K. Many companies take advantage of this and put their list of officers in their 10K or in their glossy annual report instead of in the proxy, usually on the inside back cover in many cases. If the information is included in the 10K, the instructions of item 401 requires it to appear in a separate section in Part 1 of the 10K entitled Information About Our Executive Officers. The rationale for this accommodation is that the bios for the directors is necessary to be in the proxy because at least some of these directors are being voted on, they're up for election, they're on the slate. In contrast, the executive officers aren't subject to a shareholder vote, unless of course they're also directors, they're inside directors. Then they'd be among the directors that are included in the proxy. They wouldn't be allowed to just be in the glossy annual report or 10K. Oddly, perhaps this accommodation doesn't apply to other mandated proxy disclosures about executive officers. It just applies to their bios. These are short bios. What to disclose? Item 401 requires disclosure of 6 things for officers and then 7 things for directors. So the first 6 things for officers and directors and director nominees are overlapping. It's names, ages, positions in offices, terms of office in any period served, description of any arrangements between the insider and any other persons pursuant to which they were selected as an insider, like a stockholder nominated director, and then a description of their business experience over the past 5 years. And you read the reg to find out exactly what the details you need for that. And then for directors and director nominees, there is a 7th item. Item 401E2 requires disclosure of any other boards that the person currently serves on, public company boards, or has served on for over the past 5 years. So let's drill down into some of these. For the 3rd and 4th items, the principal occupations in terms of office, practice varies regarding the specificity of the date references. Some companies reference the month and year such occupation began. Others reference only the year. The 5th one about the arrangement and understanding is sometimes forgotten. For example, maybe your company has a financing arrangement so that the holders of a class of securities issued in the financing have the right to appoint a director to your board. In this situation, disclosure of the arrangement is required. This disclosure is even required if a director is appointed during the year by the board to fill a vacancy. So the director is up for election for the first time, even though they've already been sitting on the board since they came on since the last annual meeting. For the 6th one regarding business experience, here you want to really give some deep and thorough thought about your disclosure. You want to show that your board is a strong board and the background of each director really matters to the board. You want to get specific instead of just saying so-and-so is a partner in a Big 4 auditing firm and she's a financial and accounting expert. Say that she led the practice for our industry in her firm for 10 years. So she also has deep knowledge of capital structures, financial risks, and audit practices in our industry. that's a good example of a tweak. Those kind of disclosures, which talk about how someone understands what creates a profit in your industry and growth, go a long way to making the outside world more comfortable, investors, shareholders, that your board is a strong board. Now remember, you're required to only go back 5 years, so sometimes there's an urge to go back further to highlight something that really stands out for that particular person, that officer or director. But you want to be careful if you do so and ensure you're not being selective. The risk of that is illustrated by this March 2016 court decision in which the bio for a CEO was selective and omitted that the dude had served as a CEO of a company in which he was involved with stock fraudsters. No bueno. No bueno. So ensure you're not being misleading here when you're going back more than 5 years. If someone is long retired, more than 5 years, companies often mention what they used to do and indicate how far back it was that they retired. So it doesn't look like you're trying to be misleading about that when you include this older experience and occupation. Material experience at a subsidiary is sometimes disclosed, but not if it's an immaterial subsidiary, only if it's a material subsidiary. For the seventh one about directorships, other directorships, this requirement applies only for boards of public companies, mutual funds, or investment companies. But some companies, not that many, voluntarily disclose sitting on the boards of private companies, nonprofits, charities, especially if it shows specialized experience or knowledge in the industry in which your company is in. Now, if you add this voluntary disclosure, you need to make clear which of the boards you've disclosed are public companies, since that is what item 401E2 requires, and which do not. And be wary of voluntarily disclosing information that shows a director is overboarded, that they sit on so many boards that they can't focus efficiently on this particular directorship. That can really put a target on your director's back from the proxy advisors, from shareholders, and for good reason. You don't want an overboarded director either on your board, right? And so consider that. Let me wrap up with a relationship requirement that is occasionally forgotten. Item 401D requires disclosure of any family relationship between any director, director nominee, or executive officer. The instruction to item 401D defines family relationship for purposes of this disclosure requirement to mean any relationship by blood, marriage, or adoption not more remote than first cousin. And in this court fin staff interpretation, the SEC staff clarified that disclosure is required where a director's wife is the first cousin of an executive officer of the same company, since the director and executive officer are related by marriage, not more remote more than first cousin. Location. So the director bios go in the section where you have the proposal for director election. That makes sense. By the way, I have a separate Vid-Guide about 50 sets of cool director bios. You might want to check that out. A link to that is below. Okay, let's look at some examples. I have 7 to show you. Here's Delta. This one is just from the Proxy summary. I love the business card format. And here's an example from Cognizant. And then here's something from Microsoft. Very cool. Coca-Cola Company. I have a separate Vid-Guide that analyzes the entire Coca-Cola proxy, a great one. You want to check that out. Coca-Cola has this group picture, which is jarring in this day of social distancing, of course. And this picture was taken before the pandemic. The caption notes which director is retiring from the board and which ones are standing for re-election. Here's an example from Amazon's proxy. And then here's an example from Prudential's proxy. And then the Southern Company. And then here's the full bios. So I'm going to go ahead and bring on Leah and Candace to talk more about this topic. Our guests today are Leah Huddleston and Candace Jackson. Leah is a Vice President, Associate General Counsel, and Assistant Secretary at Brown-Forman in Louisville. She's been in-house at 3 public companies. Candace is at Mayer Brown Rowe in Chicago. She's been in-house at 2 public companies. They both went to the University of Michigan, as did I. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point.
Quick Zips by Zippy Point.
Quick and dirty. So Leah, how do you benchmark who your executive officers are when you're picking out? This is a broader group than the NEO list, and I have a separate big guide about who your NEOs are. They're named executive officers. But what's your benchmarking basis typically?
Yeah, so periodically we'll take a look at our executive officers and benchmark them against a compensation peer group or folks in our industry, just to kind of see like if we're on base. Do we have too few people? Are we naming the right people? Should our list be longer? Because as you know, the list of executive officers also relates to Section 16 as well, and companies are required to make Section 16 reports for its executive officers. And so we do work to comply. We do comply with the rule. And so Rule 3B7 requires that executive officers are a company's president, any vice president over a principal business unit, division, or function, and any other person that has a policy-making function in the company. And so we want to make sure we're addressing the right people, and we do that on a periodic basis. I wouldn't say annually, but we do look at it from time to time.
My experience has been that many companies have, a formal executive committee or executive board, and they typically do not have employees outside of that group who have a policy-making function. So for those companies, they typically make it a lot easier on themselves by having a specific executive committee, and all of the policy-making decisions come from that committee, and that way they are certain that they're including all of the right people.
And I should mention, I have a separate Vid-Guide about the consequences of being named an executive officer. They're not that great, but they're significant. And then, of course, there are those executive officers that want to be named as an executive officer and they're not. And I have a Vid-Guide about why those executive officers are lucky to not be named. They should be grateful about that.
Yeah.
So Candace, how frequently should you assess, and then how do you document whom these executive officers are?
Yeah, I think it's a really good practice to be doing an assessment annually. Each year the board should be electing executive officers. And so, the assessment should be done as a part of that process. And then it will be documented, as part of the minutes of the meeting where the board considered the candidates for election as the officers of the company.
That sounds right, Candace. We do a resolution every year right around the time the filing of either compensation or the 10K. And again, those same folks are typically Section 16 filers as well. Yeah.
And then Leah, I've got separate Vid-Guide about proxy design of director bios, and the permutations of the graphics and charts used now with bios is really inspiring what companies are doing. And I even have one Vid-Guide that I made about 50 cool sets of director bios, which is a real short video, quickly breezes through a bunch of these examples. But how much do you let insiders get involved in what their bio says, particularly the 5 years worth of business? There's always a risk of a selective disclosure if there's some, but not all of an executive bios for the last 5 years, if they're sort of cherry picking.
Yeah, so typically either the corporate secretary or the legal department will take a crack at creating a bio and then submitting that bio or including that bio in the D&O questionnaires. And so officers and directors do get an opportunity to look at it and comment on it. That being said, it just varies. Like there are some people that really want to have the pen on what their bios look like, but we really try to limit, have that experience be relevant to kind of their roles at the company or their role in being a director of the company. And so I think to your point, you have to be a little careful about letting people edit it, because you don't want to be in a situation where, say, officer or director had an issue at a company and you omit that from the bio, then it's like, are you only sharing the information that's like favorable as it relates to the role? And so, we really try to stick to things that are relevant to the business. Obviously, if there's an error, you want people to correct things that we put in the D&O questionnaire. But the questionnaire is the source document that we allow directors and officers to comment on or review each year.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think, occasionally you run into a director who really wants to use their bio. They want to use their bio, their format. But we usually, encourage companies to stick with a standardized format. That way they're sure that they've included the the time frame that's required under the rules, the information that's required under the rules. And so, and of course, you know, you really want to standardize the disclosure across all of the directors for readability, for, you know, the aesthetic of the proxy statement. So, you know, I would agree with Leah, editing for errors, editing for information that, you know, perhaps didn't come up in the D&O process, or, you know, didn't come up in the research that the in-house team did to craft the initial draft of the bio. You know, they should edit for that, but no flair, unfortunately.
And there's usually some sort of, you know, some level of word counting in that. You know, it's just like when you're starting out with your first job in your resume, you're always trying to get your resume one page. And then when you're starting out, you're trying to put everything on there. You're making things up, martial arts, surfing, travel. But as you get older, then it's like I've had 20 jobs in my life and you only pick the 3 most relevant. Mm-hmm. You have that, you might have very distinguished, experienced directors and other directors who are younger and maybe not or have only worked at one company for 40 years where they don't have all those different lines. So Candace, how about disclosing board service for private companies or nonprofits? That's not required by the proxy rules, by the regulation SK.
I do see companies doing it, and, you know, I'm not opposed to it, right? You know, you want to make sure that you include everything that is required. There's nothing that says that you can't include other information. And so if a director is particularly proud of experience that they have working on a private board or for a nonprofit, you know, I typically, you know, don't blink an eye at that. I think it's fine. You know, typically, you know, we try to be consistent. So, you know, if one person wants to include it, then you kind of have to go back to everybody and, you know, give them the opportunity if they'd like to include that information as well. But yeah, I'm always open to that. I don't know if you have any different thoughts, Leah.
No, I agree with that, Candace. There's nothing wrong with including more. The only kind of practice point I would call out that is if you're going to include private companies, to make clear which companies are public or investment companies versus the private companies, just to ensure that you're complying with the rule. The other thing, to Candace's point, I would note is that if you do that for one director, the other ones may go back and say, hey, well, I want to include this too. And so consistency is really important. You want to make sure bios have parity and that there's no outlier.
For many years, I wanted to be a director. And now that I've gotten older and see more clearly what being a director is all about, and I have said on some nonprofit boards, it's not an easy job, and it's not something I aspire to, although the money certainly looks good for a public company.
Yeah.
But money isn't everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.